This is the BioCentury Show.
The BioCentury Show is supported by the BioCentury Conference Series. Join BioCentury on the road to network, partner, and debate with peers across the biopharma innovation ecosystem. Our upcoming events span the globe and feature topics from translation to company building to deal making and investment. Visit biocenturyontheroad.com for more information.
Hello and welcome to the BioCentury Show. I am Simone Fishburne, Editor-in-Chief at BioCentury. Let me start today by wishing our viewers, our audience, a very happy new year and welcoming Dr. Chris Bardon to the show. Chris is co-managing partner of MPM Bioimpact and leads the firm's public marketing investing as portfolio manager for Bioimpact equities and the oncology impact funds. So, Chris, it is a pleasure to kick off the year with you, 2025, in particular, as we are looking ahead to next week's JP Morgan conference. And I am sure we're going to get some valuable insights from you that people can hold as they are approaching that very busy week, walking into their meetings, remembering what did Chris Bardon say about this. Okay, so
well, thank you so much for having me.
Well, it is, as I said, our pleasure. And let's just start, where we at the beginning. We have seen a fair amount of uncertainty. I think one of the buzzwords, and I wrote about this, is exhaustion entering 2025. You're a public investor. Give us your take on the sentiment right now in the biotech markets.
Yeah, so 2024 was we had an incredibly volatile end to 2024. Just when people thought things were recovering, December happened, and the markets were down so much that we ended up the year nearly flat. So the question is what's going on in biotech, and when is this rebound going to happen? I think we're actually still on our 2020 hangover, to be honest. In 2020, a lot of things happened that weren't necessarily good for our industry. One, we had a lot of financings happen, which are good, but at very high valuations. And so, again, we're seeing companies that are dealing with down rounds and maybe growing into their valuations. I think, two, we also saw a lot of companies that were probably shouldn't have been financed, right? So lower quality companies got financed when there was so much capital coming in. And so from that perspective, we're also seeing, let's say, those companies slowly wind down, fail in their clinical trials, fail in their scientific development. And so I think we're still seeing a little bit of those hangover elements in both private and public biotech. And until those things kind of clear their way out, we probably won't have, let's say, blue skies and clear sailing for a little bit.
So, a couple of things there. Let me start with this idea that they're lower quality companies, let's call them, that still need to be, I think you used the word like flushed out the system, maybe, talked the other day. It is obviously an interplay here between the private markets, which are doing the company creation, and the public markets. So how is the bar, has the bar been tangibly raised for company creation as well as for going public? And maybe you can talk a little bit about what investors want to see that they might have been more forgiving about previously, but what's this new era going to look like if you're an innovator trying to bring in either private investors or later public ones?
Yeah. So I would say, in 2020, it makes a lot of sense when there's too much capital coming into the market, that there's going to be both high quality companies as well as lower quality companies being financed. There's just a lot of money coming in. But then obviously, as we went into 21 and 22, and those incremental investors left biotech, and then all we were left with is the biotech specialists like me and all of my colleagues who do biotech 24/7. In that situation, the bar for financing a company is very high, right? There's very little capital. Only the best companies in the industry are getting financed. And so that's primarily what we've seen, let's say, over the last few years as we've gone into a more, let's say, parsimonious funding environment.
Let me just interrupt for a minute because, you talk about the best companies. I promise you, every CEO thinks they have the best company. So maybe you can sort of expand on the level of data or what it is that investors are actually looking for that will make them think this really is the best company?
Yeah, no, I mean, obviously, let's double click on best. So obviously, one aspect of best is not related to quality, but just timing, right? So for example, obviously what we saw in the 2020 environment was that people were able to go public with very little data, with very little clinical data, if any at all. Some of those companies were years away from actually having a clinical trial. So some of it is just related to the time and the maturity of the company. But of course, there's also just the quality of the company. So whether it's an area that has, let's say, when we say best, we also mean, let's say, the best scientific validation, the best genetic validation, the best quality drug candidates and actual drug development. So from that perspective, that's a little bit more nebulous. But for sure, let's say the quality bar across all fronts was lower when there's more capital, and it's higher when there's less capital, right? And especially when they're only specialists, again, specialists have let's say, a higher ability to ascertain quality and what's best. Whereas if you have, let's say in 2020, what we call sloppy money spilling into the sector that doesn't have an ability to assess that, then many types of companies are getting financed, probably some of which maybe shouldn't have been financed.
So, what do you expect now, coming into this year in terms of IPOs, the IPO window? Will this, we called it like Lucy in the football because you kept being pulled away sort of thing. And is a surge in quality IPOs what it's going to take to bring generalists back? I assume this is self-reinforcing to some degree. Maybe you can talk us through that cycle a little bit.
So part of what's happening is the lower quality companies are going away, right? So whether they were private or public. And so I think that's good to, let's say, clear the table. I think in terms of, we actually have a number of high quality companies. Most of them are probably sitting in the late stage mezz round environment, right? Because basically they haven't wanted to go public. Being public is not an easy thing to do. And of course, your valuation is going to be efficiently priced. So I would say the highest, probably there are a number of high quality companies that are sitting in the late stage private mezzanine stage of financing right now. They're afraid to go public until they see that the markets are coming back. I think the other issue with some of those companies is that even though they may be high quality, they haven't yet grown into those valuations, right? So they also got financed in the 2020 environment. They had big post-money valuations, probably bigger than they deserved. They need to grow into that. They're good, so they can grow into it rather than just going away. And so from that perspective, they're growing into their valuations and then basically waiting for the environment to improve before they go out to the public markets.
And growing into it means generating clinical data that's value driving that justifies that kind of valuation. Is that what you mean?
Well, I mean, in general, we have basically, let's say, an evaluations models that are determined based upon, let's say, the ultimate cash flow of the company and the required amount of investment from a clinical development perspective to get to those endpoints, right? And so from that perspective, I would say, companies were clearly overvalued. The rough rule of thumb in general is that a company is worth 4x the peak revenue of its ultimate drug launch prior to, let's say, patent expiry. And so that's the ultimate value that it will create. But think about it. In 2020, some of those companies were getting full credit for that valuation, when they start clinical trials or very early or even before they start a clinical trial, right? So the question is this: what is the right valuation? Companies should actually not seek to get a higher valuation that they deserve. It actually makes it harder to investors to invest because you want your investors to be successful and to make money along the way. That creates the proper dynamic for you.
Do you sort of see pushback from CEOs of some of those companies? That's sort of something that we hear about. You're making the case that actually it's in a company's interest not to seek a valuation that is too high, but obviously something's gone awry there. Do you see a lack of understanding there among CEOs and some pushback?
I would say the good CEOs know that they need to make their investors successful for them to be successful. Right. And so from that perspective, they absolutely know. I mean, we've seen, for example, at IPO pricing, you take a valuation where you can see strong aftermarket trading and increased performance. That's what makes your IPO successful. You might get a little extra, if you take that little extra valuation, but you end up not having that dynamic, it can be ultimately harmful for your stock and its performance in the long term.
And I actually don't have the numbers in front of me right now for, how the IPO, last year's IPOs fared in the aftermarket, but it wasn't fantastic.
Yeah, I would say a few issues there. I mean, one, the most high quality companies probably didn't come public because they didn't need to, and they know that coming public is brutal. And so maybe let's say there's a slightly lower quality of company. I don't want to make a blanket statement. There were definitely some higher quality scientific companies that came out for sure. But then as well, again, you have to grow, you have to, generate the key clinical data that basically is going to justify your valuation and existence. And so there was some combination of, let's say, low quality companies that didn't meet their existing data, plus, let's say, a sideways to downward dynamic, which ultimately led to, I think, approximately 70+% of our IPO markets trading down post-market from their IPO.
Well, we're gonna take a short break right now. I want to pick up this conversation afterwards and think a little bit more about deal making and then some of the specific therapeutic areas and technologies you have your eye on. So we'll take a short break and we'll be back in a moment.
For 3 decades, BioCentury has helped biopharma executives and investors make business-critical decisions and build larger networks with peers across the biopharma innovation ecosystem. Our goals are simple: gather the right people in the room to partner, network, and debate critical issues facing the biotech industry. BioCentury's upcoming events span the globe and feature topics from translation to company building to deal-making and investment. We hope to see you on the road at an upcoming BioCentury event. Visit biocenturyontheroad.com for more information and to register.
We are back now at the BioCentury Show with MPM Bioimpact co-manager Chris Bardon. So, Chris, before the break, we talked a little bit about the financing and the IPO landscape. Obviously, another exit for investors and, in fact, for companies is M&A. I mean, there's also other kinds of deals, partnering deals. So let me start with this question regarding JP Morgan and sort of kicking off the year. How important is it for sentiment that we see some major deals announced?
Right. I mean, M&A is an ongoing driver for the entire biotech industry. I think we all recognize that pharma, as they redeploy the cash flow that they generate, is basically going back into partnering and licensing and M&A deals with biotech companies. They want to bring in new assets that they can put through their commercial channels. And that's really kind of the way that, let's say, the infrastructure of our industry is set up now. Now, what's interesting is that cash flow at pharma companies is more than ever, right? So if you think about, for example, the cash flow that's about to come over the course of the next decade from obesity and obesity-related illnesses, we're looking at annual revenues of north of $25 to $50 billion, right? And that money basically is cash flow into the industry, which will be redeployed by various pharmaceutical companies. There'll be more than Eli Lilly and Novo for sure. We'll see multiple companies playing in this field, generating cash flow and redeploying that. They'll deploy it in their internal R&D efforts as well as in their external efforts, which is licensing, partnering, and M&A. So I think over the next decade, we are going to see a tremendous amount of M&A activity. Now, the problem is this. We've never been a cash-strapped industry. Pharma has always generated tons of cash. The rate-limiting factor is actually the number of exciting assets that we as an industry in biotech can develop. So I think that's really kind of the rate-limiting step of any given year. Now, sometimes that just depends on the crop. I always joke, it just depends on what the crop of apples looks like this year. Nobody wants to buy an unripe apple, right? So no one wants to buy a pre-proof of concept risky asset. They want to wait till the apple's ripe, till it's completed its proof of concept trial, its clinical trial, or even its regulatory approval. So again, I would say the M&A environment just depends on the crop of apples. It to some degree depends on what the alternatives for the companies are. So if I'm a company with a great apple or a great asset, I can either develop it myself, take it through and launch it myself. If the capital markets are free and easy, I would do that. But sometimes when the capital market's more difficult, they might take the bird in hand, which is the offer from pharma. So there is some interplay with regard to the capital environment. But in general, I would say we can basically see an ongoing dynamic of healthy M&A happening in our biotech companies as rapidly as we can create the drugs.
So I'm going to come back to the whole obesity area in a minute, but just stick with this idea of M&A. So, in a few previous years, a lot of focus was on sort of big consolidations. Acquisition of Celgene was announced sort of during or prior to JP Morgan, Takeda Shire. There hasn't really been a major consolidation recently. The Amgen Horizon acquisition was, of course, held up for quite a long while with the FTC. So we're likely to have a new FTC now with a new administration. That might change the picture on consolidation. But even without that, and we at BioCentury did an analysis of this, we're seeing really a lot of deals or M&A deals, acquisitions in the $1 billion plus range, just a march up in the number of those deals. And even though in the earlier years, like 2023 and 2022, the emphasis was on what you're calling the ripe apples. By the way, just so you all know, I like my bananas quite green. So I think that there is, if we switch fruit, and I think you could actually make the case as what we started to see in 2024 was farmers actually doing deals or buying companies that were not in phase 3, that were pre-phase 3, some even preclinical, and some before proof of concept. So part of that, I believe, as you say, is about the apples, the deals that there are. I mean, basically, there weren't that many assets. Do you think with all that money that farmers have, plus their impending patent cliff, we're going to see, and the market's right now still quite close, do you think we're going to see more risk taking from the farmers going that bit earlier in their acquisitions to gather these assets, and companies, as you say, finding that a more favorable path to an exit?
Well, the problem is it's a highly competitive environment, right? So once I know that I have a ripe apple, everybody wants it, right? And everybody has equivalent cash flow and ability to compete for it, right? So the question is if I'm a pharma company, how can I get an edge in this? And so I think what we've seen is actually pharma companies getting a lot more creative. And as you said, taking some risk, right? So we can't just wait till the assets are approved. Well, we could do phase 3. Well, we can't wait till they're in phase 3. We need to go earlier, maybe even just post proof of concept. As soon as I know the drug works, I got to jump in. Right? Now, maybe in the future, your question mark is, well, will we see even earlier? Will we see them taking additional risk? I think in those settings, what we see are different structures, right? So we're not engaging in multi-billion-dollar acquisitions for preclinical assets, but what we'll see is more creative licensing structures, for example, where we have shared upside as well as shared contribution to the development path. What we'll also see, for example, is options, right? So, maybe we pay for options. What we also see is pharma getting even earlier. They're doing partnerships with venture firms. They're doing venture themselves, right? Because all of these pharma companies are thinking about how they can be competitive for this very small number of apples that comes available every year. So I think that's really the question. How can pharma be more competitive in this type of environment? They all have plenty of cash and appetite to do deals.
And you're right, because what we did see last year and in the recent years is an uptick in the number of takeouts that had either CVRs, contingent value rights, or other forms of milestone payments that share the risk or defray the risk for the pharma. And then we also saw a few cases, like 3 or 4, that went after the J&J Actelion model, where you sort of see a concurrent spin out. The pharma might be buying it for the advanced asset. The company then gets a chance to take the rest of its pipeline. And in a couple of cases, they were quite well capitalized, Biohaven's takeout, Synthorix, I think, and spin out a new company. So let's turn now. You talked about obesity. I believe you actually spotted the potential of this obesity takeoff pretty early. Not from a point of view of acquisitions or something, but just in terms of the landscape, the therapies, and the innovation going on there. How are you looking at this landscape right now?
Yeah, well, first of all, I would note it has definitely become a pharma play, right?
Mhm.
Because basically you have to run these very large and expensive cardiovascular outcomes trial. And that's just not something a small biotech company can do. So I think rule number one is you got to be a big pharma to play in this field. Also, obviously, the commercial launch is going to be expensive and goes out to primary care doctors. You need to put football ads at the Super Bowl. So again, just a very big commercial effort that, again, a small biotech company can't chew off. So from that perspective, I think we're seeing a lot of pharma activity first and foremost, right? Everybody wants to get into this game. Eli Lilly and Novo are there already, but trust me, everybody wants to get in this game. We're seeing activity from Amgen. Everybody wants to work. Now the question is this, how do they compete? The first generation of drugs are out. Those are weekly injectable drugs that result in excellent efficacy, but have drawbacks, right? Some of the drawbacks may be the side effect profile of GLPs, which are intrinsic on-target side effects. Some of the drawbacks may be the loss of muscle mass, right, which we cite. Some of the drawbacks may be related to the route of administration in terms of being sub-Q versus oral, which would be preferable. So there are many ways to improve, and companies who want to get into want to skate to where the puck is, right? So they want to get in on chapter 2 and chapter 3 of where we're going. So I think that's where we're seeing the most activity. And pharma is very aggressive about that. They are for sure willing to take risk and do early stage deals. This field lends itself to that because you can actually de-risk assets relatively early. Efficacy can be clearly seen in preclinical models and early clinical models. And safety profile, let's say, is the only question mark. But we generally have a pretty good sense of tolerability and large-term safety. I would say we can usually suss out genetically pretty well. So this is an area that lends itself to early stage aggressive deal making for sure. We're seeing a lot of deals and takeouts early on. I think we're seeing a lot of, and biotech again has many plays in this field. They won't be able to take drugs all the way through to completion, but for sure they're going to generate them through proof of concept. And so we're seeing efforts on all of the above, right? New targets, new routes of administration, drugs that improve the muscle loss profile or decrease muscle loss or increase muscle. Oral administration. So those are all, let's say, topics of fervent interest within biotech.
So, obviously, as you point out, Lilly and Novo really lead and own this field. But it is also a massive, massive global market. And we've even seen supply problems, right? Which indicate that, to me, that there should be room for quite a few players. I agree with the idea that they have to be pharma players because those trials are just big and long and expensive. But do you expect to see a flood of farmers in this and all of them being able, like, how much room is there? Can they all be generating those kind of revenues?
Yeah, I mean, basically anyone who has, let's say, a cardiovascular or primary care sales force effort is probably going to be playing in this field, right? They're already in the field, right, by virtue of their current commercial footprint. So again, I expect to see all of those players involved. This is the biggest indication our industry will ever see. We have over 140 million patients in the United States that are affected by obesity, right? All of those patients also suffer tremendous morbidity and mortality associated with their obesity. We're also seeing, for example, expansion of treatment into some of those morbidity issues. For example, these drugs were just approved for sleep apnea. Sleep apnea is a side effect, is a sequela of being morbidly obese, right? And so now we're seeing efficacy in sleep apnea and MASH and many of these, let's say, comorbid illnesses or resultant illnesses of obesity. So this is the biggest indication in the history of our industry and maybe ever, right? So everybody's going to be playing in this. Absolutely.
So I want to go to another huge indication, maybe not as huge, but still pretty huge. It's not really an indication so much as a disease area, I&I, immunity and inflammation, and that has become super hot. There were, in fact, my colleague Lauren Marks did an analysis of last year's approvals, and in fact, only 3 out of 50 really fell in this field where we're talking about NMEs. And that might just reflect the field that, FDA approvals are a lagging indicator. The field is starting to take off. And in some cases, what you're looking at, of course, is approved drugs that have indication expansions that might not be captured in those numbers. But I want to ask you how you see this field unfolding. And is it going to be a longer arc, let's say, to see I&I innovations that happen at a sort of a molecular, even genetic level? Or do you think that what we've got is a few drugs that work really well and they're just going to now be taken through various different indications in terms of indication expansion? How do you think about I&I right now?
Yeah, I mean, I&I has been hot for a long time, right? I mean, obviously, TNFs, for example, are one of the biggest categories as well in drug development and in the commercial marketplace. But what we've seen is, let's say, a proliferation of interesting new targets and modalities for treating. So our ability to understand and manipulate the immune system has just become much more sophisticated. And so now we have options for all of those patients who weren't responding well or who ultimately respond but then fail their TNF drug, right? So this has always been a big indication. Will continue to be a big indication. These patient numbers are obviously smaller. So, we're talking diseases that have, let's say, a prevalence of between 60 and 150,000 patients in the US. So they look more like orphan drugs according to the orphan drug definition. The reimbursement for these categories does tend to be attractive, though. On average, they tend to be reimbursed between $40,000, $80,000 to $80,000 a year. So do the math, right? This is an exciting and interesting commercial opportunity. Again, with lots of new modalities and attractive options. So I think we're seeing a lot of activity here. By the way, some of the most exciting work, which we haven't even yet understood what the commercial opportunity is around the ability to potentially cure these diseases. So the CAR Ts and the interplay between immunity using, let's say, treating the immune system is really exciting. The fact that we could cure a lupus patient rather than put them on lifelong steroids, to me, is an utter miracle and would be incredibly transformative to those patients. So I think that's actually some of the most exciting stuff. That's a TBD in terms of what the commercial endpoint is going to look like, but we're seeing a lot of activity on CAR Ts, bispecifics, antibodies, et cetera, that address the immune system, underlying immune system.
So I want to turn just at the end here. We have a couple minutes left. We talked about 2 areas that, one of them, obesity, was fallow for a long time, right? We've seen that in neurology. Even inside I&I, like lupus went nowhere for a very long time and now has a lot of hope. There are other areas. I want to ask you about women's health, right? Women's health is an area that actually covers so many different actual indications. There's obviously no indication of women's health, but there are things like endometriosis, which is very broad, and other areas which have really not been well funded or explored. Breast cancer has, and so is ovarian cancer, but there's lots of other areas. I'm wondering what your view is about investment in women's health and what might be a trigger for any kind of increase in activity in that sort of field.
Yeah, I mean, I would say women's health has not been a tremendous area of focus for our industry. To be honest, I'm not quite sure, right? Obviously, indications such as endometriosis or fibroids affect a tremendous number of women and are huge unmet medical needs, right? The use and our ability to, let's say, treat those diseases with existing, let's say, hormonal options are not very effective. To be honest, I don't quite understand why it hasn't been a bigger area of focus. I would say years ago, there was some focus into that area, which is
I think it's just
not
that there aren't
right.
scientific. Is it funding at the very scientific level that isn't creating the breakthroughs, or is it that investors don't really see a path to that? How do you break this down?
Well, some of the indications are related to pain. So I'm just brainstorming. Sorry, you caught me off guard. This is a tough
Oh.
question, honestly. Some of the indications are related to pain, and pain is really hard to treat. So that may be one of them, right? So, for example, one of the issues that we're addressing with women with endometriosis or fibroids is pain, right? Not just interested in shrinking the fibroid objectively, I need to address the woman's symptom.
Mhm.
So pain trials are always messy, right? They're always messy. Some of it may be related to, let's say, our ability to fundamentally change the course of the disease, right? So again, why was obesity fallow for so long? Because we didn't have anything that worked very well, right?
Yeah.
Right. And we have had GLPs for a dozen plus years. They just didn't cause weight loss in the formulations that we previously tested. So again, sometimes innovation needs to come together with the unmet need and result in meaningful efficacy before, let's say, a field takes off. And so again, I'm just hypothesizing right now, but those would be two of my hypotheses as to why women's health has been a hard area to develop drugs in.
Well, thank you for going there when I hadn't necessarily, as you say, I caught you off guard. I'll just end by asking you, to name one or two areas that you're really excited about for either this coming year or the ones after that. Well, tell us what you've got your eye on that we haven't talked about.
Yeah, so I would say I think endocrinology is really one of my most favorite areas right now. We're seeing a lot of activity. First of all, the biology behind endocrine diseases related to cortisol, related to thyroid, PTH, etc., mostly has been very difficult to handle because they all needed protein therapeutics. And now we're seeing actually proliferation of our ability to drug those targets with small molecules. So again, I think we're seeing a huge amount of activity in endocrinology, which is really exciting. I think also protein therapeutics continues to be next generation protein therapeutics in cancer and other diseases continues to be really exciting. So again, we're seeing in cancer, for example, radioligand-based therapeutics taking off. We're seeing ADCs take off. We're seeing also TCEs, T-cell engagers now take off. And again, these drugs offer not only dramatic efficacy compared to their small molecule counterparts, but also a differentiated side effect profile, which may be improved, and the option for potential cure, which is really exciting. I think gene therapy has been a little bit in the doldrums for the last few years, but I'm seeing a few companies which are actually making true disease-altering improvements in gene therapy. So companies like a Rocket or a Stoke, again, in those situations, it wasn't that the technology wasn't good enough, but we had to find the right indications for them and the right ability to deliver those genes. So those would be a few of my favorite areas looking forward.
Well, that is a great place to end what has been a great conversation. Thank you very much, Chris. I wish you a great JP Morgan and a very happy and successful new year. And a peaceful one too. Thank
And
you.
to all our listeners, bye-bye.
The BioCentury Show is supported by the BioCentury Conference Series. Join BioCentury on the road to network, partner, and debate with peers across the biopharma innovation ecosystem. Our upcoming events span the globe and feature topics from translation to company building to deal making and investment. Visit biocenturyontheroad.com for more information.